perfect body in classical yoga. Welcome, Mona.
First of all, I want to express that I'm really excited and nervous to give my presentation today, because this is a product of having read the work of most of the people that are here, especially Ian Richard, Daniel Rabe, Dr. Timalsina, Erin Ryan. So for me, this is like a bhavana, maybe, because it's not anymore a monologue, it's actually becoming a dialogue. So I'll start. So what I'm presenting to you today is a section of my doctoral dissertation, and my dissertation has a title, Philosophy of Mind as a Philosophy of the Body, the Subtle Layers of Bodily Awareness. And what I'm trying to do there is to respond to the question, what is to be aware of one's own body? And I'm doing it from a comparative perspective, which means that I'm taking into consideration both Western philosophical discourses on the body, as well as Indian, specifically Orthodox philosophy, Indian philosophy. And I'm also trying to approach the question from a feminist phenomenological perspective, because I am interested in recovering the notion of the body that represents, in a non-reductionist way, the feminine experience. So this section specifically focuses on the notion of a perfect body, the Kaya Sampad, which appears in the third pada of the Yoga Sutra. Okay, so the title of my presentation, as it appears in the program, is the perfect body in classical yoga philosophy, but it should actually be the perfect self-aware body in classical yoga philosophy. And the addition of self-aware to perfect body is relevant if we consider that within Samkhya metaphysics, tradition in which yoga philosophy is circumscribed, and I apologize if many of these ideas are being repeated, because I am basically considering all the ideas that have been put already on the table. Okay, so the addition of self-aware to perfect body is relevant if we consider that within Samkhya metaphysics, tradition in which yoga philosophy is circumscribed, only Purusha, or the self, is conscious, while the body, the psychophysical complex, the body-mind, being part of Prakriti or nature, is ultimately not conscious. Some scholars have argued that this distinction should not be interpreted as a metaphysical, but rather as an epistemological preliminary for the attainment of a full and liberating awareness while enjoying embodied life. Ian Richard, for example, has argued that the epistemic process of isolating consciousness from all its determinations is needed to existentially experience freedom in our body and mind. But this isolation of consciousness is not to be interpreted in any sense as separation with matter, with which it is always related. This, in spite of Vyasa's interpretation of Sutra 434, where he takes Kaivalya, or isolation, as the state where there is no more association, anabhisambandha, of Purusha and Buddhi, remaining thus the power of self-aware consciousness alone. I believe that the nature of the tension and difficulty of arguing for a non-dualist position within the Yoga Sutras lies in the philosophical presupposition, present both in Samkhya and Yoga, that the psychophysical complex by itself lacks the capacity of self-awareness. And I say this because even if we agree with the epistemological reading of dissociating Purusha and Prakriti, and recognize that in yoga, consciousness and body are never not in a mutual relationship, it is ultimately consciousness alone which can give the body awareness of itself, if at all. This is a problem for a feminist perspective, because this dissociation, whether metaphysical or merely epistemological, has as a consequence the dissociation between body and self. And historically, both in India and the West, the body has usually been identified with the feminine. Indeed, Prakriti is the feminine that dances for the sake of the seer, and in the West, the feminine has been the body that beautifies itself to please the male. If becoming aware of oneself means becoming aware of the body as distinct to the self, and we are aware of this in many of our meditative practices as saying, I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am not this and this, then, I argue, there cannot be bodily self-awareness. If the body, that is Prakriti, is not capable of awareness by itself, then awareness of one's body, and particularly one's female body, is dependent and always mediated by someone else's gaze. And if this is true, then the body, nature, and the feminine could never really be free. Furthermore, they could never be recognized by the other, that is, by the seer, as its equal counterpart, for only another consciousness would count as that. Yoga, however, is a practice famous for the cultivation of bodily self-awareness. And this is because, as I will argue, there is a sense in the Yoga Sutra in which Prakriti can be self-illuminating. And I believe that this can be found in the notion of Kaya Sampat, the perfect yogic body. So now I'm going to proceed to my argument, and I just laid it out here so that I hope it becomes clear. Okay, so in yoga, the process of knowing something is a process of becoming that which is to be known. In the case of one's own body, the process is described as a series of stages that bring attention to the body from its most evident functions to its less observable ones. It starts with the observation of our bodies and actions, both in the physical and moral sense, which translates into the practice of observing the truthfulness, kindness, integrity, continence, and generosity of our actions on one part, the yamas, and the cleanliness, contentment, discipline, reflexivity, and surrender expressed by our bodily attitudes on the other, the niyamas. This is followed by a practice of bodily stillness or steady body posture that allows for the mental faculties to be focused despite distractions coming from opposite sensations. The yoga posture, asana, within this context, is understood as a position of the body that creates the conditions for a meditative state, characterized by the one-pointedness and absorption of awareness, where the self, of this self-absorption of awareness, would include here the body in its innermost layers, as I will show. So keeping the physical body still and steady is an embodied way to become aware of other more subtle transformations that go unnoticed within the flesh. And I'm using flesh in its phenomenological sense, both as the body that is felt and the body that feels. So making the body still can allow for to become aware of other more subtle transformations, such as the constant movement of the breath. The aim is to achieve a moment of stillness and steadiness within the motions of inhalation and exhalation, through which even subtler movements of one's body become noticeable. Finer sensations may come to the forefront, but the tendency of the sense capacities to go after the sensation is also to be withdrawn, so that an even more refined awareness can arise. Having withdrawn the faculties of sensory perception from their corresponding external objects into a point of focus within one's own body, the movements of the mind, chitta-vritti, perceptions, thoughts, images, dreams, memories, become more evident. At this point, the process of self-awareness is supposed to follow the same structure through which we get to know the body as we inhabit it in all its levels. Observing the movements of the mental objects and detecting moments of cessation within make the moments without mental objects become more evident than the mental states themselves, and a point of mental arrest, nirodha, is achieved. A distracted mind switches its point of focus continuously, but when the mind is placed in a point of focus, and this is maintained with a similar flow of ideas and attention to the same object, then the mind enters into meditation. The continuous and steady practice of meditation gives place to Samadhi, or yogic state of contemplation, defined as the shining forth of the object in the mind as if this one was empty of its own form, that is, of its own subjectivity, as Dr. Timalsina explained yesterday. In Samadhi, contrary to ordinary perception, any object towards which the mind focuses its attention, be it a physical object, a place in one's own body, a thought, an emotion, a sensation, or the mere sense of being oneself, is supposed to appear directly without the grasping motion of the cognitive faculties. In deeper levels of Samadhi, the object is considered to arise within the mental field without the mediation of any verbal or conceptual construction. At this level, even the sense of I amness that accompanies every act of fixation and concentration is surrendered. With all the subjective and cognitive apparatus being arrested, one would suppose that all sense of awareness will completely black out. However, according to Patanjali, the state that remains is one of arrested experience, an experience characterized by surrendering the will to know, to act, to know or to act on an object. With no more mutation or changing object to observe, even those arresting experiences vanish themselves, leaving the self in a state of pure awareness, where it realizes itself in its own form, unmediated by the senses, thought, or words, distinguishing itself from the intellect and the rest of the cognitive and sense capacities. In a way, we see here reproduced the Samkhyan idea that the perceptual system, and indeed any body and material object, are unconscious. Also in yoga, the body needs another ultimate instance to make it manifest to experience, and this other instance is absolute consciousness, the real seer. In Sutra 419, Vyasa argues that if the perceptual system were self-illuminating, then it would not be perceivable by something else. And Vyasa makes the interesting analogy with space, akasha. He says, well, we say that empty space is supported by itself, Vyasa explains, because nothing else supports it. But in the case of the mind, its cognition becomes manifest through experiences such as I am angry, I am afraid, it is pleasing to me, it is painful, etc. This means that there must be a seer that perceives both the mental content and the fact that it is being I who has it. In other words, the manifestation of our body-mind processes is supported by something other than them, that is consciousness. Now, in yoga, as I have tried to explain, the only way to see the seer seeing itself is by silencing the perceptual system and stilling the body-mind movements. It could be said that the body becomes a space of pure silence where the totality of outer directed processes are put in hold. In this complete cessation of activity, nirodha, we would be able to experience, or better said, to become, the ground that supports the whole system of perception, the mind-body complex. And in Sutra 342, we can see that Vyasa himself thinks that the body's support is akasha, empty space. It is not insignificant that Vyasa had mentioned akasha as an example of self-support. If consciousness is self-illuminating because it is like space, in that there is nothing else that supports it for its own manifestation, then it is difficult to see why the body, which is experienced as pure space in Nirodha, would not be self-aware. Silencing the body-mind function does not mean that the body vanishes. Rather, just like in Samkhya, the reflective function of buddhi, along with the rest of cognitive functions, merge into the background, becoming invisible, as if it were an empty field, an empty space. It seems then that in the state of pure awareness, embodiment is experienced as pure space, in which case the analogy between self-awareness and akasha would also hold for the body and for prakriti. Thus, if consciousness is self-conscious because it is self-supported, then the body, being self-supported, is also self-aware. So I basically developed the argument through 1 to 10. Now I need to explain how this body, this self-aware body, is the perfect body. So I'm going to talk about 11. As Samprajñata Samadhi, or a meditative state without object, is considered in the Yoga Sutra as the ultimate liberating state of self-awareness. In the contemplative level of Samadhi, the mind is supposed to be so calm and transparent, purified from all its ideas, feelings, emotions, dreams, memories, preconceptions, and further tendencies, that the only thing experienced is consciousness alone. This ultimate state in yoga has many times been interpreted as exhibiting its dualist metaphysics, because it is understood as a state of aloneness, in which the power of consciousness, Chitti Shakti, is established in its own form, and the cosmic elements of creation merge back into the original state, having fulfilled the seer's purpose, that of seeing itself as distinct from the body of the world. The metaphysical interpretation has usually understood the merging back of the elements into their source as a movement without return, implying that once the body has given as a product not only experience of the world, but discernment between this one and a free consciousness, the body would finalize its days just like a pot will, turning around due to the residue of the initial movement for the purpose of which it was first set up. Once the inertia has exhausted all its impetus, it will stop. The elemental and subtle bodies will dissolve, die, and never be born again. For philosopher Daya Krishna, however, this reading of the Yoga Sutra, if right, is not at all satisfactory. Why would the ultimate state of Samadhi and its immediate consequence, liberation or moksha, have to be identified with a final moment of no return? I think Daya Krishna is right. Phenomenologically, even the most profound state of arrest achieved with the practice of yoga could not be understood without the process of transformation that the psychosensory unit has to go through. And only within the lived body could the experience of self-awareness be liberating. For it is within this embodiment that the self experiences the spontaneous exercise of its own will, and at the same time the supreme power to withdraw it. For Daya Krishna, if the final stage in yoga is freedom, then this one should include the capacity of consciousness to detach from the world and introvert, as much as the capacity to face the world and enjoy if it wills it. I think that we can find this double possibility of the power of consciousness within the Yoga Sutra, a consciousness that would allow for a self-aware embodied freedom, where the vision of the true self is accompanied by the beauty, charm, strength, and adamantine robustness of a perfect body. In the famous third pada of the Yoga Sutra, just after the ultimate state of Samadhi has been described, along with the steps and conditions to experience it, more than 20 powers attained by yogic perception are enlisted. There it is said that by applying samyama, that is the final three techniques of yoga, practice, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, powers can be attained according to the chosen object of meditation. Moreover, the famous yogic powers are considered to be a natural consequence and a sign of the yogic process of transformation of the mind towards liberation. At the same time, in a commentary that immediately precedes the sutra about the perfection of the body, Vyasa explains that the powers attained by yogis with a perfect body include, paradoxically, the stronger power of not using them. A yogi or yogini would not disturb the cosmic order of the universe even if it was within his or her power to do it. The further warning to not indulge in celestial powers and the call to detach even from the knowledge that consciousness and the world are distinct can be read not as a call towards an ultimate point with no return, but as an awareness of the dual power of consciousness. In Daniel Rave's words, that nivritti, total introversion of consciousness and stoppage of all vision in Patanjala Yoga, is the self-consciousness of willing from within willing itself, and willing observed through the eye of willing, like closing quote. The perfect yogic body, I conclude, is thus the body free from the automatic necessities to will, to know, and to act. And this is the way, I think, in which a body, a perfect body, supports itself, becomes aware of itself, and liberates itself. A perfect self-aware body can see what is distant, concealed, invisible, and subtle, by placing light on that which is the source of its own emerging activity, pravritti. And according to Patanjali, it can also manage its own spatiality by becoming small, big, trespassing objects, etc. In this sense, perfect bodies are not merely space, but self-aware space within bodies as well. They are the expression of the double power of consciousness to draw within and out. Here, an objection could be raised. To conclude that the body is self-aware would strengthen rather than banish the dualist position. We would now have two self-aware principles instead of one conscious self and an unconscious nature. Moreover, my objector could continue. To interpret the perfect body as self-aware spatiality would be a rather anomalous Vedantic reading of the Yoga Sutras. To respond to this objection, I would like to resume my departing point of view, which while agreeing with not metaphysically separating consciousness and nature, disagrees, however, with the distinction even in its epistemological terms. By recognizing the body's capability for self-awareness, I think I am radicalizing the non-dual relation between body and self, nature and consciousness. For I sustain that the Yoga Sutra holds a theory of the body where the statement, I am this body, does not mean that consciousness, the seer, or the true self is reduced to the material biological body, nor that the psychophysical body is ontologically the same as the self. All I am defending is that in the phenomenological experience of cultivating awareness of one's own body, a conscious experience of oneself as this body, and this body as conscious of itself, has to be included. Otherwise, not only would truly embodied freedom be impossible in the Yoga Sutras, but also would be the fair and full recognition of the other, represented in the embodiment of nature and the feminine. Thank you.
Okay, take questions.
I'd like to celebrate the echo of your position in both the second prakarana of the Yoga Vasishtha and the Nirvana prakarana of the Yoga Vasishtha. Specifically, the simple terminology given forth by Vasishtha that whether sadeva or nirdeva, whether with a body or without a body, liberation is the same. It's a philosophical assertion. And then the example is given in the Nirvana prakarana of Chudala. And Chudala quickly attains utter freedom, assumes the body of a man in order to educate her doltish husband, and then eventually not only brings him to full presence, but the two of them carry out their duties of ruling their kingdom from what had been asserted in the second prakarana, as if there's no difference between sadeva and nirdeva, deha rather, sadeva and nirdeha. So I wanted to just suggest this may be a place where you may want to look for a little affirmation. Not yet.
Sorry, I was just rolling. It's really good. Very impressed. Maybe you also want to explore a little bit on Nikaya texts for the same issue. I don't remember the entire passage right now, but there's one line that Tatkena Vijanati Kaina Anupashyati, because the issue comes like in this Asamhi and Nirodha, highest state of Samapati is who knows that he is even in Samadhi. And particularly for the Buddhists, it's problematic because you cannot even say that there is the Atman at that state, because when a yogi wakes back, there's just the body left. His mind stops, and in the asangi state, and there is no karma to constitute further either, because it's a vijnana rupa karma. So how can a yogi even know that he was in a samadhi, that this knowledge is directly accessed by the body itself? So maybe that is also relevant for him.
Your presentation is really thought-provoking with respect to the status of the body in the Yoga Sutra, and especially your association of the body with Akasha, which is kind of a primordial kind of being emerging right beyond, after, Brahman, actually. Something very abstract and very present in the Upanishadic literature throughout. It's very interesting, your association of the body with Akasha, with space. But also, something you make me think about the distinction between Kaya and Sharira, because Kaya is one thing, and you used it. Yeah, Kaya, you avoided referring to the Sharira, which is, as a morbid reader of the Yoga Sutra, what comes to mind is that Sharira is Himsakrita, is made of violence, etc. In Vyasa's commentary on 250. Yeah, but so when Kaya seems to be something else, some Kaya, like in Yoga Sutra 329, I think it's Navichakre Sanyamat, Kaya Vyuha Jnanam. Yes. So it's Kaya and Sharira are different, and the very distinction is most interesting to me. Thank you very much for raising this.
I guess I was presupposing that Kaya and Sharira would be sort of the same. I do need to go back to the text and see how Sharira is playing.
Even etymologically, Sharira is a Shirya deity, something that keeps on decomposing. And for Kaya, Tsiya Chayane, so you accrete, you select. There is some kind of a selection process embedded with having Kaya, and that is, to me, is more positive. That's something that keeps, reviving itself, rejuvenating itself. That is Kaya. Something that keeps on going down, that just keeps disintegrating, that is Sharira. So the kind of a more positive connotation with Kaya and a very negative connotation with Sharira, etymologically only.
Okay, finally, all right. Okay. I'm linking this with sort of previous discussion. So granted the point that there are transformative possibilities within the perfect body, but linking it up with the earlier discussion that we had on death, would there be any limits to even the perfect body in terms of consciousness, which the notion of death understood in a specific way might be able to point to? I mean, granted everything that you've said following Jaya Krishna and so on about consciousness having to be embodied in order to bring about transformation, what would be the limits of that process in terms of pointing to that kind of death?
The limits in terms of knowledge, what can a perfect body know? Yeah. Or the limits in terms of what can a perfect body do?
Both.
Your question takes me back to Kevin's presentation when we ask God if He can make mistakes, and it's sort of like there's no answer. It's like a contradiction in itself. How can God make mistakes? So how can a perfect body would not be able? How could a perfect body have limitations? But yet, as Vyasa says, a perfect body, even if it could change the whole universe, it wouldn't do it. So maybe the question that I need to ask is why? Why, if the perfect body could have some limitations, what type of limitations the perfect body can have, and why? And if those limitations would have to be self-imposed limitations, are not imposed from outside.
Thank you. I have two questions and one remark with regard, first of all, to the question whether Sharia and Kaya are different. I think you're right that these are synonyms in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So it is said that it's Kaya, Vyuha, Jnana, which arises, but then the explanation which follows in the Bhashya is actually an outline of an Ayurvedic view of the human body, very much in line with what we find in early Ayurvedic sources. Not exactly what is recorded in the Ayurveda in the Charaka Samhita, but probably another now lost earlier source might be the background of Patanjali's conception of the human body. Now, one question I would like to raise is, there are a couple of instances where the body is treated quite dismissive in the Bhashya passages, saying that it's unclear, impure in many respects, and that one has to disassociate oneself from the own body in order to reach final liberation. That consciousness of the body, or involvement with the body, and especially involvement with the female body from the perspective of man, is a severe hindrance on the way towards Kaivalya. So how would this relate to your perspective of the body in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra? That's one question. And the second would be, from a historical perspective, I think the conception that the human body may be may achieve a certain kind of perfection is something that we find also in Rasayana and other forms of techniques that are not primarily yogic in their concern, but have a certain space within the field of yoga. And how would you see the relationship between this straits of thoughts to Sankhya Yoga in its more philosophical context?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to do is think with the Yoga Sutra as it can speak to me, to us, in this present context. And by doing that, I think that I'm not really sticking closely to the text. In some way, I need to go beyond it. And there might be parts such like the ones you just mentioned that I might not relate to, and that I disagree with the Yoga Sutras. And I want to disagree with the Yoga Sutras. I don't want to say that the Yoga Sutra, that we can save it all from the Yoga Sutras. So that would be my answer. Regards to other systems, I think that we need to start talking about other yoga texts and see how the body is perceived there and how we can come back to this self-aware embodiment and start dialoguing with these other traditions and see how we relate to them as yoga practitioners.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I really want to say I appreciated your paper and what you're trying to do here. So my reading is that you're almost engaging in something much more constructionistic, right? I mean, from the point of view of, let's say, feminist theology, queer theology, systems like that. So can you talk a little bit more about sort of ideologically what it is that you're trying to accomplish here? You know, you brought feminist studies up at the beginning, right, and you circled it around back to it at the very, very end in your final sentence there, but I would just love to hear a little bit more about really what you're kind of trying to accomplish.
Oh, you're basically asking me to say in one sentence what my dissertation is about.
It could be more sentences.
I wanted to ask the question, what is the subtle body in Indian philosophy from the philosophical point of view? And as I was doing that, I either I was falling into a, sort of a historical interpretation, which I didn't want to, or I was falling into discourses from philosophy that were not allowing me to really get into what is happening with the subtle body. The only place I found a way to understand the subtle body from Western philosophy and in comparative perspective is with phenomenology, especially Merleau-Ponty, and with the criticism that Luce Irigaray does to Merleau-Ponty. And Luce Irigaray is not a specialist in Indian philosophy by any means, and she has been criticized a lot by talking about yoga philosophy and Indian philosophy without really doing her homework. But I find in her texts about breathing, about pranayama, a really interesting way of reading the subtle body with the notion of flesh. Because the subtle body is this category that is not fully, it's not a materialist body, and it's not a mind. It's not reducible to cognitive processes or to the brain or to anything like that. So yeah, I found in that type of philosophy a way to approach the topic. And yeah, so basically what I want to do is a reading of the subtle body in dialogue with Western phenomenology and embodied cognition.
It's about noon. I don't know if you guys are getting hungry. Do you want a couple? Okay, a couple more. Does anyone else have any more questions?
I really enjoyed this. I've read different parts of your dissertation, and I want to read more. So it's great to hear. Great to hear another part of your dissertation. My question, I'm not sure if you've answered this already, or implicitly or explicitly. My question is, on this reading of the Yoga Sutras, how can we accommodate other bodies and otherness generally? How does the perfect yogic body relate to other people's bodies, other bodies? Is there room for becoming self-aware of other bodies, not just your own?
So obviously the perfect body, the self-aware perfect body is not a self-referential body. It's a body that has gone beyond its own ego. And so I think that if we take that into consideration, what kind of experiences we can have when we have gone beyond the ahamkara, that element that constructs us as individuals, and we can go beyond that, we need to pose that question. I think that with this framework, with a self-aware body that is not self-egoic or self-referential, there is definitely room to experience other bodies in that space. But again, it has to be a creative space, because as Chakravarti has, as the main preoccupation of Chakravarti is, you cannot completely identify with the other, because then you cannot help. You cannot help someone in the suffering if you cannot. But that needs to be done with a self-aware body that has the power to master the going out and the going within.
The Brahma of the heart. Sukha, Dukkha, Punya, Apunya, and the four great qualities of Maitri, Karuna, Upeksha, Mudita.
I think this relates to what previously addressed Joseph on the limitation of the body, how can a perfect body recognize its limitation. I have just a simple thought on it, that a perfect ruler is a perfect ruler because he recognizes his limits. And the moment a ruler does not recognize his limits, he is a mad ruler. So the same way, a perfect body is a body that recognizes its powers and the lack thereof. And in this full awareness of the lack thereof, or the absence of its presence, there is the other already known, just the way it knows its body. It's known through absence.
I want to add something to the question of other bodies. Kessi Bhattacharya has a very interesting analysis of the body and the subject as freedom. So he suggests that I cannot see my back. And the fact that I cannot see my back is different from the fact that I cannot see the backs of other things. And then in a sense, to perceive myself as a whole, I'm dependent on others. So for him, the notion of the body assumes the other.